In the islands of Japan, long before written history carved its first characters into ancient texts, there existed stories whispered between generations like sacred winds carrying the voices of gods. These tales formed the foundation of Shinto, a belief system so deeply woven into Japanese culture that it breathes through every shrine gate, flows through every mountain stream, and lives in the reverence shown to nature itself. Unlike many mythologies that speak of distant heavens unreachable by mortal hands, Shinto tells of gods who walked the earth, shaped the very islands beneath our feet, and whose presence still lingers in the sacred places of Japan today. The word Shinto translates to the way of the gods, and it represents one of the world's oldest, continuously practiced spiritual traditions. What makes these myths particularly fascinating is their connection to the physical landscape of Japan. These are not abstract stories set in faraway realms. Every mountain, every river, every peculiar rock formation has its divine story. The kami, or spirits, number in the millions according to tradition, inhabiting everything from towering ancient trees to the smallest pebbles on a beach. The primary sources for these legends come from two ancient texts. The Kojiki, completed in 712, stands as Japan's oldest surviving book, while the Nihon Shoki, written in 720, provides additional accounts and variations. Together, these chronicles preserve a mythology that shaped an entire nation's identity, influenced its imperial lineage, and continues to guide spiritual practices across Japan to this day. Today, we journey into the heart of these timeless legends. We will witness the birth of Japan itself, meet gods whose passions and conflicts mirror human struggles, and discover how a goddess hiding in a cave plunged the world into darkness. We will stand beside a storm god as he faces an 8-headed serpent, and we will uncover the sacred treasures that connect ancient myth to modern Japan. These are the legends from Shinto mythology. Before there was land, before mountains rose toward heaven or waves crashed upon shores, there existed only formless chaos. The universe resembled a vast egg of primordial matter, swirling and shapeless, silent and dark. Within this cosmic void, particles drifted and collided in the emptiness, creating barely perceptible movements that would eventually give birth to all existence. Then came the first stirrings of order. Light particles, being lighter than the dense matter surrounding them, began their ascent through the chaos. They rose upward, though slowly, unable to match the speed of pure light itself. Eventually, these ascending particles formed clouds, and from those clouds emerged Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven. The heavier particles that remained below continued their slow consolidation, forming the foundation of what would become the earth, though it remained formless, resembling oil floating on water or a jellyfish drifting through an endless ocean. In this newly formed heaven, the first deities spontaneously came into being. 3 primordial gods emerged: Amenamina Kanushi, the deity of the center of heaven, followed by Takamimusubi and Kamimusubi. These 3 kami appeared and immediately concealed themselves, establishing a pattern that would repeat with the next generation of gods. More deities emerged in succession, each appearing spontaneously, without gender, without partners, and each choosing to hide themselves from view after manifesting. Then came 5 pairs of gods, each consisting of male and female deities who were both siblings and spouses, a common motif in creation mythologies worldwide. The 7th and final generation of these paired deities were Izanagi, meaning he who invites, and his younger sister Izanami, meaning she who invites. These 2 would become the most important figures in Japan's creation story, the divine couple tasked with bringing order to the formless world below. The elder gods looked upon the oily, drifting mass that was to become the earth and issued a command to Izanagi and Izanami. They must solidify and shape this floating chaos. They must give it form and substance. To accomplish this sacred task, the divine couple received a magnificent gift, the Ame no Nuboko, a jewel-encrusted spear that would become one of the most important tools in all of Japanese mythology. Standing together upon the floating bridge of heaven, Amano Hashidate, which connected the celestial realm to the world below, Izanagi and Izanami gazed down at the swirling chaos beneath them. Izanagi took the jeweled spear and thrust it deep into the primordial ocean, stirring the waters in great circular motions. The divine couple churned the formless sea, mixing and blending the elements until, when they lifted the spear from the depths, droplets of brine dripped from its tip. These drops fell back toward the ocean, but instead of dissolving back into the water, they crystallized and solidified, forming the very first island, Onogoro-shima, meaning self-forming island. Descending from heaven to this newly created land, Izanagi and Izanami established their dwelling place. At the center of the island, they erected an enormous pillar called the Heavenly Pillar, and around it, they built a magnificent palace. Looking upon their new home and recognizing their divine purpose, the two deities understood that they must unite to create more land and populate the world with gods. They devised a sacred marriage ritual. Walking in opposite directions around the great pillar, they would meet on the other side and speak words of greeting before consummating their union. As they performed this ceremony for the first time, Izanami, the female deity, spoke first when they met, exclaiming her joy at seeing such a handsome man. Izanagi responded in kind, but almost immediately he protested that this was incorrect. He, as the male, should have been the one to speak first. This ritual error, this disruption of cosmic order, would have consequences. Their first child was born malformed, a grotesque creature without bones called Hiruko, the leech child. Unable to stand or grow properly, this unfortunate being was placed in a reed boat and set adrift on the ocean, cast away from its parent's sight. Their second child was the island of Awashima, but this too was deemed unsatisfactory and was not counted among their rightful offspring. Troubled by these failures, Izanagi and Izanami returned to the gods of heaven to seek guidance. The elder deities performed a divination ritual and revealed the source of the problem. The woman had spoken first during the marriage ceremony, violating the proper order of things. Armed with this knowledge, the divine couple returned to Onogoro-shima and performed the ritual again, this time ensuring that Izanagi spoke first when they met at the pillar. This time, their union proved abundantly fruitful. Island after island sprang into being from their creative power. They gave birth to Awaji, then the 4 regions of Shikoku, followed by the islands of Oki, Kyushu, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and finally the great island of Honshu. 14 islands in total formed the Japanese archipelago, each one a child of the divine couple, each one destined to become part of a nation that would revere its creators for millennia to come. But Izanagi and Izanami did not stop with creating land. They continued their sacred work, bringing forth the kami who would inhabit and govern different aspects of the world. The god of the sea emerged from their union, followed by the god of trees, the god of mountains, and the god of wind. Deity after deity came into existence. More than 35 kami born from the loving union of the divine couple. Each new god took dominion over a different aspect of creation, together forming the foundation of the natural and spiritual world. Yet tragedy awaited, even in this divine paradise. Izanami prepared to give birth to Kagutsuchi, the fire god, and the delivery went horribly wrong. As the deity of fire emerged from Izanami's body, his very nature burned his mother with unquenchable flames. The pain was excruciating beyond measure. Even as she suffered, new deities were born from her agony, emerging from her vomit, her excrement, and her urine as she writhed in torment. But these small mercies could not save her. Despite being a goddess, despite being one of the creators of all existence, Izanami could not survive the burning. She died from her wounds and was taken to Yomi, the dark realm of the dead. Izanagi's grief was absolute. He wept bitterly, crawling around his beloved's body, crying out in anguish. How could he have lost his wife, his partner in creation, for the sake of a single child? His tears fell upon the ground, and from each tear, new deities were born, kami of sorrow and lamentation. But these divine births could not ease his pain or fill the void left by Izanami's absence. His sorrow transformed into rage. Drawing his great sword, Izanagi turned upon Kagutsuchi, the fire god whose birth had killed his beloved. With a single mighty stroke, he beheaded the god of fire, cutting the divine. But even this act of vengeance brought no comfort to the grieving god. Izanagi could think only of his wife, his partner, the goddess with whom he had created the world. He made a decision that would change everything. He would descend into Yomi, the land of the dead, and bring Izanami back to the world of the living. The journey to the underworld was long and dark. When Izanagi finally reached the shadowy realm of the dead and found his wife, he begged her to return with him. The world was not yet finished, he pleaded. They had so much more work to do together. Izanami's voice came to him from the darkness, tinged with sadness. She had already eaten the food of Yomi, she explained, and that simple act bound her to the land of the dead. Those who consume the food of the underworld cannot leave its borders. However, she promised to speak with the gods of Yomi and ask for permission to return. She made Izanagi swear a solemn oath. He must not look upon her while she was in this state. He must not light any lamps or create any flames. He must wait in darkness for her return. Izanagi agreed and settled down to wait. Hours passed in the absolute blackness of the underworld. The silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by distant, unidentifiable sounds. Izanagi's patience wore thin. What was taking so long? Why hadn't Izanami returned? Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, he broke his promise. He lit a small flame from his divine comb, holding it high to pierce the darkness. What he saw would haunt him forever. Izanami's body had begun to rot and decay, infested with maggots that writhed across her decomposing flesh. 8 thunder deities had taken up residence in different parts of her courts. This was no longer the beautiful goddess he had loved. This was a thing of death and corruption, a nightmare vision of what his beloved had become. Izanagi screamed in horror and fled, running through the dark passages of Yomi as fast as his divine legs could carry him. Behind him came an enraged shriek. Izanami had awakened, and she had seen her husband's look of disgust and horror. Shame and fury overwhelmed her. She sent the ugly females of Yomi in pursuit of the fleeing god, their grotesque forms shambling after him through the darkness. Izanagi ran faster, but the creatures of the underworld gained on him. He threw his headdress behind him, and from it sprang wild grapes. The pursuing women stopped to devour this fruit, giving Izanagi precious moments. He threw his comb, and bamboo shoots sprouted from the ground, which the pursuers again stopped to consume. But these delays were temporary. The chase continued. Then Izanami herself joined the pursuit, no longer asking the dead to hunt for her, but coming after her husband with her own rotting feet. The very sight of her corpse form chasing him spurred Izanagi to even greater speed. He could see light ahead, the border between the underworld and the living world. With a final burst of divine strength, Izanagi reached the entrance to Yomi and found an enormous boulder. With all his might, he pushed this massive stone across the opening, sealing the underworld and preventing Izanami from following him into the world of the living. From behind the boulder came his wife's voice, now cold with hatred and vengeance. She cursed him for his betrayal, vowing that she would kill 1,000 of his creations, 1,000 humans, every single day. Izanagi's reply echoed in the darkness between them. If she would kill 1,000, then he would ensure that 1,500 were born each day. Thus, through their broken love and mutual curse, death and life would forever balance in the mortal world. The sacred union of the creator deities had ended in tragedy, separated by a stone barrier between the realms of the living and the dead. But Izanagi knew that he had been contaminated by his visit to the land of death. The impurities of Yomi clung to him, and he required purification. He traveled to the river of Woto, and there performed a cleansing ritual, washing away the taint of the underworld. As he removed each piece of clothing and cast it into the water, new deities emerged. As he bathed different parts of his body, more gods came into being. This ritual of purification, harai, would become a cornerstone of Shinto practice, reenacted in various forms at shrine entrances throughout Japan for thousands of years to come. The most important moment of Izanagi's purification came at the very end of the ritual. As he washed his face, 3 extraordinary deities burst into existence, the most powerful and significant gods in the entire Shinto pantheon. These 3, born from Izanagi's eyes and nose in the aftermath of his brush with death, would become known as the 3 precious children, the Mihashira no Uzu no Miko. When Izanagi washed his left eye, light exploded into being. From that eye emerged Amaterasu Omikami, the great divinity illuminating heaven, goddess of the sun itself. Her radiance was so brilliant, so utterly overwhelming, that her very presence brought warmth and light to all of creation. Izanagi looked upon his daughter with wonder and joy, recognizing immediately that she was destined for greatness. From his right eye came another deity, more subtle in power but no less important. Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, the moon god, emerged with a pale, mysterious light that would illuminate the night sky. Where Amaterasu represented the bright clarity of day, Tsukuyomi embodied the enigmatic beauty of darkness, the softer light that guides travelers through the night. Finally, when Izanagi washed his nose, a third deity appeared. Susanoo no Mikoto, the storm god, came into the world with the sound of thunder and the smell of rain. From the moment of his birth, Susanoo was temperamental and unpredictable, embodying the wild, untamed forces of nature. His power was immense, his emotions volatile, and his presence brought both life-giving rain and destructive tempests. Izanagi looked upon these 3 extraordinary children and made a momentous decision. He bestowed upon each of them dominion over a portion of creation. To Amaterasu, he gave rule over Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven itself, making her the supreme deity of the celestial realm. The sun goddess would reign over the divine kingdom, bringing light and order to the heavens. She received a magnificent necklace of 500 jewels as a symbol of her authority, beads that glowed with an inner radiance matching her own luminous nature. To Tsukuyomi, Izanagi granted sovereignty over the realm of night. The moon god would rule when his sister's light withdrew, providing gentle illumination during the dark hours and governing the tides and cycles that responded to lunar influence. His domain was one of reflection and mystery, of hidden things revealed in shadow and silver light. For Susanoo, Izanagi designated rulership over the sea and storms. The tempestuous young god would command the waters that surrounded the newly created islands of Japan. bringing rain to nourish the land, but also unleashing his fury in typhoons and tempests when his emotions ran wild. His was a domain of power and chaos, of life-giving water and destructive floods. However, Susanoo did not accept his fate with grace. Despite receiving such an important domain, the storm god wept and raged, his cries shaking mountains and causing widespread flooding. When asked why he was so unhappy, Susanoo claimed that he mourned for his mother, Izanami, and wished to join her in the underworld of Yomi. This refusal to accept his responsibilities and his constant tantrums began to cause problems. His tears created deluges that drowned valleys. His shouting triggered earthquakes that crumbled hillsides. Izanagi, frustrated and disappointed by his youngest son's behavior, made a harsh decision. Susanoo was too chaotic, too emotional, too disruptive to remain in the ordered realm of heaven. The god who had just lost his wife, who had just fled from the horrors of the underworld, now had to banish his own son. Susanoo was ordered to leave Takamagahara and never return. But before departing for his exile, Susanoo decided to say goodbye to his sister Amaterasu. This decision would set in motion a series of events that would test the very fabric of creation and plunge the world into darkness. Amaterasu watched from her heavenly palace as her brother Susanoo approached, and she did not like what she saw. The storm god came with such violence that mountains trembled in his wake and the very seas churned into foam. This was not the approach of someone coming in peace. Amaterasu suspected treachery. Perhaps Susanoo coveted her position. Perhaps he came to usurp her throne in heaven. The sun goddess would not be caught unprepared. She armed herself for battle, transforming herself into a fierce warrior. She bound up her hair in the manner of a male warrior, coiled her long garments to allow freedom of movement, and equipped herself with a quiver of 1,000 arrows on her back and another 500 at her side. She strung her bow and planted her feet firmly, stamping the ground with such force that the earth sank beneath her like fresh snow. This was no delicate goddess of light. This was a deity prepared to defend her realm with all the power at her command. When Susanoo arrived and saw his sister in this martial stance, he protested his innocence. He meant no harm, he insisted. He had only come to bid her farewell before descending to the mortal realm. But Amaterasu's suspicions were not so easily dismissed. She demanded proof of his pure intentions. Susanoo agreed to demonstrate his sincerity through a sacred trial that would reveal the truth of his heart. The trial took the form of a contest of divine creation. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword, broke it into 3 pieces, chewed them in her mouth, and then spat them out. From the mist of her breath emerged 3 beautiful female deities, delicate and graceful. Then Susanoo took the magnificent necklace of 500 jewels that his sister wore, crushed the beads in his mouth, chewed them, and spat them out. From this mist came 5 male deities, strong and noble. A dispute immediately arose. Susanoo claimed victory because the gentle, beautiful female deities born from his sword proved the purity of his heart. Amaterasu countered that she had won because more deities had been created from her necklace. Eventually, the gods ruled in favor of Susanoo's interpretation. His sincerity was proven. He could remain in heaven. Proving his good intentions and behaving with the decorum expected in the celestial realm were 2 very different things. Susanoo's true nature soon revealed itself. Filled with joy at his victory, he went on a destructive rampage through heaven. He broke down the divisions between sacred rice fields that Amaterasu had carefully cultivated. He filled in the irrigation channels. He defecated in the hall where sacred offerings were prepared for divine festivals. Each act was more outrageous than the last. Yet Amaterasu, in her compassion and sisterly love, made excuses for him. When the gods complained about the destroyed rice fields, she suggested that Susanoo simply wanted to maximize the land available for planting. When they reported the feces in the sacred hall, she proposed that her brother had simply gotten drunk and didn't realize what he was doing. The sun goddess tried to see the best in her brother, tried to excuse behavior that was clearly beyond the bounds of acceptable conduct. Then Susanoo committed an act so terrible that even Amaterasu could not forgive it. In one of the halls where divine weavers created sacred garments for the gods, craftswomen sat at their looms, weaving with great skill and concentration. Susanoo captured a divine piebald colt, one of the celestial horses, and flayed it alive. Then he climbed onto the roof of the weaving hall and hurled the bloody, skinned corpse through the ceiling. The horse crashed onto the floor of the hall in a spray of blood and gore. One of the weavers, shocked by the sudden violence, jerked backward in terror. Her movement drove the shuttle of her loom upward, and the sharp point pierced her body, killing her instantly. Sacred blood mixed with equine blood on the floor of the hall. Divine weaving was interrupted by violence and death. This was too much. This could not be excused or explained away. Amaterasu felt a mix of emotions: rage at her brother's cruelty, grief for the dead weaver, shame that she had allowed things to progress this far, and perhaps guilt that she had not disciplined Susanoo more firmly when his misbehavior first began. Overwhelmed by these feelings, the sun goddess made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for all existence. She retreated. She withdrew from heaven and the earth. Amaterasu found a cave called Ama no Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, and entered its depths. Then, using her divine power, she rolled an enormous boulder across the entrance, sealing herself inside and cutting off all contact with the outside world. With the sun goddess gone, her radiant light vanished from existence. Darkness fell across the world instantly and absolutely. The high plane of heaven plunged into shadow. The islands of Japan below lost all illumination. Without the sun's warmth and light, crops began to wither. The careful order that Amaterasu had maintained collapsed. Evil spirits, emboldened by the darkness, emerged from their hiding places and began to cause mischief and harm. Chaos spread like a disease. The 800 myriads of gods, all the divine beings who inhabited heaven and earth, gathered by the tranquil river of heaven to hold an emergency conference. Something had to be done. The world could not survive without the sun. But how could they convince Amaterasu to emerge when she had sealed herself away so completely? The wisest of the gods, Omaikane, whose name meant thought combining, proposed a plan. It would require careful coordination and the participation of many deities, each contributing their particular skills and powers. The assembled gods agreed to the strategy and set to work immediately. First, they gathered thousands of roosters, the birds whose crowing traditionally announced the dawn. These birds were placed near the cave entrance with instructions to crow all at once, creating a cacophony that would suggest to Amaterasu that morning had somehow come despite her absence. The roosters' voices echoed through the darkness, urgent and insistent. Next, the gods erected a sacred sakaki tree near the cave entrance. This wasn't just any tree, but a divine specimen perfect in every way. On its upper branches they hung the Yasakani no Magatama, a string of magnificent curved jewels that glowed with their own internal light. On the middle branches they placed pure white cloth, symbols of ritual purity, and divine offerings. And at the center of the tree, they hung something truly special, a perfect octagonal mirror called Yata no Kagami, polished to such brilliance that it could reflect even the faintest light. This mirror had been forged by Ishikoridome, the patron god of mirror makers, who had worked night and day to create something worthy of luring out the sun goddess.
Various gods took up positions around the cave entrance, each ready to play their part in the elaborate scheme. Strong gods stood ready to act if Amaterasu showed even the slightest crack in the cave entrance. Other gods prepared offerings and prayers. The stage was set, but they needed something more, something that would capture the sun goddess's curiosity and draw her out despite her resolve to remain hidden. This is where Ame no Uzume no Mikoto, the goddess of dawn and revelry, stepped forward. Uzume placed an upturned wash tub in front of the cave entrance, positioning it carefully to create a makeshift stage. She wore bells that jingled with every movement and carried sacred bamboo grass. Then she began to dance. But this was no ordinary, dignified performance. Uzume danced with wild abandon, stomping her feet on the resonant wash tub, creating a rhythmic pounding that echoed through the darkness. She waved her bamboo grass frenetically. Her movements grew more and more frenzied, more provocative. Then, in an act of divine audacity, she began to remove her clothing, baring her body as she danced with increasing frenzy. The assembled gods watching this spectacle could not contain themselves. Laughter began to ripple through the crowd. Then, more gods joined in, until a great roar of merriment echoed through the heavens. 800 myriads of gods laughed and cheered, creating such a commotion that it seemed impossible anyone could ignore it, even from deep within a sealed cave. Inside the darkness, Amaterasu heard the laughter. How strange, she thought. The world was plunged into eternal night, crops were dying, evil was spreading, and yet the gods were celebrating? Curiosity began to gnaw at her resolve. What could possibly be so joyous that the gods would laugh during such a catastrophe? Unable to resist any longer, she called out from within the cave, her voice barely audible through the thick stone, asking what was happening. The gods shouted back their reply. They had found a goddess even more brilliant than Amaterasu, they claimed. A deity whose radiance surpassed even the sun goddess's light. The celebrations were in honor of this new goddess who would replace Amaterasu. This was a lie, of course, but it achieved its purpose. Amaterasu's curiosity overwhelmed her. She had to see this supposed deity who outshone her. Slowly, carefully, she rolled the boulder aside just enough to peek out through a narrow crack. The moment she did, her eyes caught the gleam of the sacred mirror hanging from the sakaki tree. In its polished surface, she saw her own reflection, though she did not realize it was herself. The radiance reflecting back at her was indeed magnificent, as brilliant as anything she had ever seen. Transfixed by the glowing figure in the mirror, convinced she was looking at this supposed new sun goddess, Amaterasu stepped forward slightly, opening the cave entrance wider to get a better look. That moment of distraction was all the gods needed. Ame no Tajikarayo, the god of strength, lunged forward and grabbed Amaterasu's hand, pulling her bodily from the cave. As she stumbled out, another deity, Fudodama, quickly stretched a sacred rope of braided straw, a shimanawa, across the cave entrance behind her, preventing her from retreating back into the darkness. The moment Amaterasu fully emerged from the cave, brilliant light exploded across all of creation. The darkness that had oppressed the world vanished in an instant. Warmth returned to the land. Plants that had begun to wilt straightened and resumed their growth. The evil spirits that had emerged during the darkness fled back into their hiding places, unable to withstand the sun's holy radiance. Order was restored to the heavens and the earth. The assembled gods rejoiced, their plan having succeeded beyond their hopes. But consequences awaited those whose actions had caused this crisis. Susanoo could no longer remain in heaven. His behavior had nearly destroyed all of creation. The gods passed judgment on the storm god. He would be exiled permanently from the celestial realm. But before they cast him out, they inflicted punishment. His magnificent beard was shaved off, his fingernails and toenails were torn out, and he was assessed an enormous fine of gifts and restitution. Only then was he banished to the mortal world below. As for Amaterasu, she returned to her position as ruler of heaven, her light once again bringing order and prosperity to all existence. The mirror that had drawn her from the cave, the Yata no Kagami, became one of her most sacred symbols. To this day, it is said to reside in the Ise Grand Shrine, the most important Shinto shrine in all of Japan, and it serves as one of the 3 imperial regalia that legitimize the rule of Japan's emperors, connecting the mortal imperial line directly to the divine sun goddess herself. Disgraced, injured, and exiled, Susanoo descended from the heavens to the mortal realm. He fell to earth in the province of Izumo, in the western regions of what would become Japan. Specifically, he arrived at Mount Torikama, near the headwaters of the Hi River, known today as the Hi River. As he walked beside the flowing water, still adjusting to his banishment and nursing his wounded pride, he noticed something peculiar floating downstream, a single chopstick, carved from wood, clearly made by human hands. Susanoo's divine mind processed this observation quickly. If there was a chopstick in the river, then people must be living upstream. The storm god followed the river upward, curious about what kind of mortals made their home in this region. Before long, he heard the sound of weeping, the deep, wrenching sobs of those experiencing profound grief. Following this sound, he came upon a scene that would change the course of his life and redeem him in the eyes of gods and humans alike. He found an elderly couple sitting beside a beautiful young woman. All 3 were crying bitterly, their faces wet with tears, their expressions hollow with despair. Susanoo approached them and asked what caused such terrible sorrow. The old man looked up at the stranger who had appeared so suddenly, and through his tears, he introduced himself. His name was Ashinazuchi, meaning foot-stroking elder, and he was an earthly deity, a child of the great mountain god Oyamatsumi. His wife, sitting beside him with her head bowed in grief, was Tenazuchi, hand-stroking elder. The young woman with them, their daughter, was called Kushinada Hime, meaning wondrous rice-field princess. As Ashinazuchi told his story, his voice broke with emotion. Originally, he and Tenazuchi had been blessed with 8 daughters, 8 beautiful girls who had been their joy and pride. But then the curse had come. For 7 consecutive years, a monster had arrived each summer, demanding tribute. This creature was no ordinary beast. It was Yamata no Orochi, the great serpent of 8 branches, a dragon so enormous and so terrible that even mentioning its name caused brave men to tremble. Every year, the serpent would come and devour one of their daughters. The first year, it had taken their eldest. They had wept and mourned, hoping that this single sacrifice would satisfy the beast. But the next summer, it returned, and they had to surrender their second daughter. Then the 3rd year came, and the 3rd daughter was consumed. Year after terrible year, the pattern repeated. They watched helplessly as the serpent took their 4th daughter, their 5th, their 6th, and their 7th. Now only Kushinada Hime remained, their 8th and final daughter, the last trace of their once large family. The time was approaching when Yamata no Orochi would return once more. When that day came, they would lose everything. Their family line would end. They would have no descendants to honor them, no one to carry on their legacy. This was why they wept with such desperation. They faced not just the death of their beloved child, but the extinction of their entire bloodline.
Susanoo listened to this tale, and something stirred within him.
Perhaps it was compassion for these suffering mortals. Perhaps it was the sight of beautiful Kushinada Hime and a desire to claim her for himself. Perhaps it was simply the prospect of a worthy challenge, a chance to prove his valor after the humiliation he had endured in heaven. Whatever the motivation, the storm god made an offer. He would kill this serpent for them. He would free them from this yearly horror, but in exchange, he wanted their daughter's hand in marriage. The old couple looked at this stranger who had appeared so suddenly with such a bold proposal. They asked who he was to make such a claim. Susanoo revealed his divine nature, explaining that he was the brother of Amaterasu herself, recently descended from heaven. The earthly deities immediately prostrated themselves before him. Of course, they agreed, if a god of his stature would save their daughter and take her as his bride, they would be honored beyond measure. What parent wouldn't agree to such terms when the alternative was watching their child be devoured by a monster? Susanoo accepted their agreement and immediately set about preparing his strategy. First, he used his divine power to transform Kushinada Hime into a comb, which he placed in his hair. This would keep her safe during the coming battle and ensure that she remained close to him. With the princess secured, he turned his attention to the more practical preparations for confronting the dragon. He instructed Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi to brew sake, but not just any ordinary rice wine. They must distill it 8 times, refining it again and again until they had created the strongest, most potent alcohol imaginable. While the couple set to work on this task, Susanoo ordered the construction of a special fence, one with 8 gates built into it, and at each gate, a platform should be erected. On each of these 8 platforms, they were to place a large vat. When the sake was ready, each vat would be filled to the brim with the powerful drink. The old couple hurried to complete these preparations, working through the day and night to have everything ready before the serpent's arrival. When the appointed time came and Yamata no Orochi finally appeared, the sight was more terrible than words could adequately capture. The creature's 8 heads rose above the tree line, each one massive beyond comprehension, each mouth filled with rows of teeth like sword blades. The heads were connected to 8 separate necks, but these necks joined to a single enormous body. The dragon was so large that its form stretched across 8 valleys and 8 hills. When it moved, trees were crushed beneath its bulk. Rivers changed their courses. The very earth groaned under its weight. The creature's appearance was nightmarish in detail. Its eyes glowed red like the fruit of winter cherries, burning with an inner fire that spoke of malevolence and hunger. On its back grew trees and moss, ancient vegetation that had taken root in the rough texture of its scales over the long years of the monster's existence. This was no mere beast. This was a force of nature given reptilian form. A creature that had existed for so long that it had become part of the landscape itself. The dragon's belly was perpetually bloodied and raw, scraped and torn from dragging itself across the rough terrain as it moved. This constant wound never healed, always weeping blood that tainted the rivers and streams it crossed. The monster stank of decay and death, the smell of 7 years' worth of victims still lingering in its many stomachs. Yamata no Orochi approached the fence that Susanoo had constructed, expecting to find its yearly tribute waiting in fear. Instead, it discovered 8 vats of sake positioned invitingly at each gate. The dragon's multiple heads swayed, confused by this unexpected change in the ritual. Where was the young woman? Where was the terrified family? Why was there sake instead of screaming? But dragons, like many creatures, can be easily distracted by simple pleasures. The serpent smelled the powerful alcohol, and whatever cunning it possessed was overwhelmed by the allure of the strong drink. Each of the 8 heads dipped into a different vat, and Yamata no Orochi began to drink. The creature consumed the sake with enthusiasm, all 8 heads slurping and gulping simultaneously. Vat after vat was drained. The dragon drank until every drop was gone, and the alcohol, distilled 8 times to maximum potency, began to take effect on the monster almost immediately. The 8 heads swayed more noticeably now, weaving back and forth not in menace, but in intoxication. The dragon's movements became sluggish. Its glowing red eyes began to droop. Before long, the massive creature collapsed where it stood, all 8 heads falling heavily to the ground. The great serpent began to snore, each head producing a different rumbling tone that together created a cacophony of drunken sleep. This was the moment Susanoo had been waiting for. The storm god emerged from his hiding place, drawing his sword. This was the 10-span blade that he carried as part of his divine armament, and now he would put it to its ultimate test. Susanoo approached the sleeping dragon and began his work. He started with the tails, hacking and slicing through the tough, scaled flesh. 8 tails, each as thick as a temple pillar, were severed from the main body. The dragon stirred, but didn't wake, too deeply drugged by the powerful sake to respond to the pain. Susanoo moved on to the heads, and here his work was more difficult. These were massive things, each skull the size of a small house. He had to strike repeatedly, his divine blade rising and falling, cutting through scale and bone and sinew. Blood flowed like a river. The high river itself ran red with the dragon's vital fluids, a crimson torrent that would stain the waters for days afterward. Susanoo moved systematically from head to body, from body to tail, dismembering the creature with methodical efficiency. This wasn't a glorious battle of speed and skill. This was butchery, the practical work of destroying a monster that had terrorized the region for too long. As Susanoo worked his way along the dragon's enormous body, cutting through the thick hide and dense flesh, something unexpected happened. When his blade struck the 4th tail, he felt unusual resistance. The sword struck something hard concealed within the meat, and the impact was so solid that it actually notched his divine blade. Curious, Susanoo cut more carefully around this obstruction, peeling back layers of flesh to reveal what lay hidden inside the dragon's tail. There, embedded in the serpent's body, was another sword. This blade was extraordinary, far exceeding even Susanoo's own divine weapon in quality and power. It was longer and sharper, forged with such skill that even among the gods, few weapons could match it. The sword seemed to generate its own light, a blade that could cut through anything in existence. Clouds themselves would part before its edge. Susanoo pulled the sword free from the dragon's corpse and held it up, marveling at its balance and beauty. He knew immediately that this was no ordinary blade, but something of immense significance. This was a treasure that belonged not with him, but with the supreme ruler of heaven. Despite their troubled relationship, despite his exile and punishment, Susanoo recognized that this sword should go to his sister Amaterasu.
He sent the blade to heaven as a gift of reconciliation and respect, naming it Ama no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds. This blade would later become known by another name, Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, after being used by a later hero to cut down flames in a burning field. Together with the sacred mirror and the jewels, this sword would become one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan, symbols of divine authority, passed down through the imperial line for over 2,000 years. The sword that Susanoo pulled from a dragon's tail in ancient Izumo still represents the legitimacy of Japan's emperors today, a direct link between myth and modern sovereignty. With Yamata no Orochi dead and dismembered, Susanoo returned to the grateful Ashinatsuchi and Tenetsuchi. He transformed Kushinada Hime back from her comb form, and the beautiful princess stood before him, saved from the fate that had claimed her 7 sisters. True to his word, Susanoo took her as his bride, and the couple was married with the blessings of her relieved parents. Susanoo then set about establishing his new life in the mortal realm. He chose a location in Izumo to build a palace, and the place he selected had what he described as a pleasant atmosphere. There, he constructed a magnificent dwelling, and as he did so, he composed what is considered to be the first poem in Japanese literature. The verse described clouds rising, creating an 8-fold fence to protect the palace where he would live with his new bride. From Susanoo and Kushinada Hime descended a lineage of deities who would rule over Izumo. Their great-great-great-great-great-grandson would be Okuninushi, the great lord of the land, who would play his own crucial role in Japanese mythology as the deity who ruled over Japan before the descendants of Amaterasu arrived to claim sovereignty. But that is another story for another time. The storm god who had been exiled in disgrace had found redemption through heroism. He had saved innocent lives, slain a terrible monster, and recovered a sacred treasure. He had proven that even a deity who caused chaos and destruction could also be a protector and champion. Susanoo's legend became one of transformation and second chances, showing that even the most troublesome of gods could find purpose and honor. The legends of Shinto mythology continue to live and breathe throughout Japan, even in our modern age. These are not merely ancient stories relegated to dusty books and academic study. They remain active elements of Japanese culture, shaping how millions of people understand the relationship with nature, with their ancestors, and with the divine forces that permeate the world around them. Throughout Japan, over 80,000 Shinto shrines stand as physical embodiments of these ancient myths. The torii gates that mark the boundaries of sacred space echo the Shimenawa rope that prevented Amaterasu from retreating back into her cave. Shrine visitors purify themselves with water, reenacting Izanagi's ritual cleansing after his journey to the underworld. Offerings of sake, rice, and salt are made to the kami, maintaining relationships between humans and the Grand Shrine of Ise, dedicated to Amaterasu, receives millions of pilgrims every year. The shrine itself is rebuilt every 20 years in a ritual that has continued for over 1,000 years, maintaining ancient architectural techniques and spiritual practices in an unbroken chain connecting the present directly to the mythological past. The sacred mirror, one of the 3 imperial regalia, is said to reside there still, though no living person outside the imperial family and highest priests has seen it in centuries. The Emperor of Japan, even today, claims direct descent from Amaterasu through her grandson Ninigi, who descended from heaven to rule over the earthly realm. While the emperor no longer holds political power as in ages past, the imperial line remains the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy in the world. its legitimacy rooted in these ancient myths of solar divinity and cosmic order. Every emperor's enthronement ceremony involves rituals that reference these creation legends,
connecting modern Japan to its mythological foundations. The myths also shape how Japanese people view nature itself. Unlike religious traditions that place humanity above the natural world, Shinto teaches that divine spirits inhabit everything. Mountains are sacred because they house kami. Rivers are holy because they are kami. Even rocks and trees that appear somehow unusual or awe-inspiring are recognized as manifestations of divine presence. This fundamental respect for nature has influenced Japanese art, poetry, garden design, and environmental attitudes for centuries. The heroes and gods of these myths appear throughout Japanese popular culture. Amaterasu, Susanoo, and Yamato no Orochi show up in video games, manga, anime, and films. The stories are retold and reimagined for new generations. Their themes of chaos and order, light and darkness, exile and redemption, resonating just as powerfully today as they did when they were first told over 1,000 years ago. These legends from Shinto mythology remind us that myth is not merely fiction or primitive explanation for natural phenomena. Myth is a way of understanding our place in the cosmos, of recognizing forces greater than ourselves, and of connecting present reality to ancient truths. The gods who shaped the islands of Japan, who brought light to the world, and who fought monsters in mortal lands, continue to shape how millions of people understand their world and their purpose within it. From the cosmic coupling of Izanagi and Izanami, to the sun goddess hiding in her cave, from the storm god's redemption to the eight-headed serpent's defeat. These stories weave together to create a mythology as rich and complex as any in human history. They are Japan's founding legends, the sacred narratives that explain not just how the islands came to be, but what it means to be Japanese, to live in harmony with nature and the divine forces that permeate all existence. So the next time you see images of torii gates standing in water or forests, when you hear about a Japanese festival honoring local spirits, or when you encounter references to these gods and heroes in modern media, remember that you are witnessing something ancient and powerful. You are seeing the living legacy of myths that have shaped a nation and a culture for over 2,000 years. Stories that continue to matter, continue to guide, and continue to inspire. If you enjoyed this journey through the legends of Shinto mythology, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more myths and legends waiting to be explored, from cultures across the world and throughout history. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may the kami watch over you.